New Mexico Territory, 1875. The splitting of wood should have been a simple task. Sophia Hall knew this as she positioned the axe above the log for what must have been the 10th attempt that afternoon. Her arms trembled from exertion, the cold air burning her lungs as she drew in a frustrated breath. 5 winters alone in this cabin, and still she struggled with the most basic necessities of survival. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, adjusting the woolen shawl around her shoulders. The mountains of northern New Mexico stretched around her like silent guardians, beautiful but indifferent to her struggles. The November sky hung low and gray, promising snow before nightfall. "One more try," she whispered to herself, the sound of her voice strange after days of silence. As she raised the axe again, memories of Frederick crept into her mind unbidden. Her husband had been gone for 2 years now, lost to typhoid somewhere along the trading routes to Santa Fe. They had been married for 5 years before his death, though married seemed too intimate a word for what they had been. Housemates, perhaps. Business partners in a venture that had yielded little joy for either of them. Frederick Hall had been nearly 20 years her senior when their union was arranged, a successful merchant seeking a young wife to maintain his home while he traveled. Sophia had been 19, her prospects limited by her family's dwindling finances, her dreams of becoming a teacher set aside for the security of a respectable marriage. What followed were 5 years of dutiful coexistence. Frederick was not cruel, merely distant, his passion reserved for ledgers and business dealings rather than his young bride. Their wedding night had been brief and awkward, setting the pattern for the rare moments of physical intimacy that followed. When he was home, they occupied the same space without truly sharing it, like polite strangers in a boarding house. Now, 2 years a widow, Sophia sometimes wondered if she mourned the man or merely the structure his presence had provided. The monthly stipend from his business partners still arrived, but it was never quite enough, and the isolation of the cabin, once a blessing that spared her from performing wifely duties, had become a prison of silence and solitude. The axe fell, missing the center of the log and glancing off the side. Sophia dropped the tool with a cry of frustration, tears stinging her eyes from both the cold and her own helplessness. "What would Mother say if she could see me now?" she muttered. Her parents lived just 2 days' ride away in the small settlement of Cimarron, always encouraging her to abandon this isolated existence and join them. But something kept her here, pride perhaps, or the stubborn belief that she could forge a life of her own making. Lost in thought, she nearly missed the subtle shift in the air around her. A presence, a feeling of being watched. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself facing a stranger. He stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and still as the ponderosa pines that surrounded her cabin. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, adorned with a single eagle feather. High cheekbones framed eyes that seemed to absorb everything without revealing anything in return. His buckskin clothing and the quiet confidence of his posture told her immediately what her husband had taught her to fear. Apache. Sophia froze, her mind racing through all the terrible stories shared around settlement fires. Tales of raids and kidnappings that Frederick had used to justify keeping her isolated in this remote cabin while he traveled. But the man before her carried no visible weapons, and his stance remained relaxed, almost cautious. For a long moment, they simply regarded one another. A white woman alone in the wilderness, an Apache warrior far from his people's territory, both equally unexpected to the other. Then, with a deliberate slowness that suggested he didn't wish to frighten her, he gestured toward the axe at her feet. His meaning was clear, even without words. She should have been terrified. She should have run into the cabin and barred the door. Instead, something in his eyes, a quiet dignity perhaps, or the absence of the menace she'd been taught to expect, made her hesitate. I can manage," she said, though the evidence of her failed attempts lay scattered around her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He took a step forward, then paused, waiting for her reaction. When she didn't retreat, he approached with measured steps until he stood before her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, suggesting he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, not much older than her 26 years. He extended his hand, palm up, and nodded toward the axe again. Sophia found herself caught in a moment of decision. Everything she had been told, everything she believed about the world beyond her cabin, told her to fear this man. Yet here, in this clearing, with snow beginning to dust the ground around them, those warnings seemed to belong to another life. She bent down, picked up the axe, and after a moment's hesitation placed it in his hand. His fingers brushed against hers, warm despite the cold air, and Sophia felt a strange current travel up her arm. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, then turned toward the woodpile. With fluid grace that made the task seem effortless, he positioned a log, swung the axe in a perfect arc, and split the wood cleanly down the middle. The sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Within minutes he had reduced the entire pile to neatly split firewood, each piece a testament to the strength and precision she had lacked. Sophia watched, mesmerized by the economy of his movements. There was nothing wasteful or showy in his work, just a quiet competence that spoke of a lifetime living in harmony with the demanding land around them. As he worked, she noticed details: the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the well-worn knife sheath at his belt, the single strand of hair wrapped with red thread that bound the eagle feather to his temple. When he finished, he gathered an armful of wood and looked toward her cabin with a questioning expression. Sophia nodded, leading the way to her porch where he carefully stacked the wood against the wall, protected from the snow that was now falling steadily. As they worked together in silence, carrying load after load, Sophia found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The precise movements of his hands, the way snowflakes melted against the warmth of his skin, the careful distance he maintained, as if aware of her unspoken fears. When the last piece was stacked, he handed the axe back to her, handle first. Their eyes met, and Sophia felt an unexpected urge to ask him to stay, to break the overwhelming silence that had been her only companion for so long. "Thank you," she said instead, the words inadequate for the strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity she felt. "I'm Sophia." He regarded her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to speak. When he did, his voice was deep and accented, but his English clear. "Baishan," he said simply, touching his chest. "Baishan," she repeated, feeling the unfamiliar name on her tongue. He nodded once more, then stepped back, preparing to leave as mysteriously as he had arrived. But before he turned, his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The storm comes," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "You have wood now. Stay warm." With those words he disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving Sophia standing on her porch, axe in hand, wondering if the encounter had been real or a trick of her isolation-starved mind. That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in her small hearth, Sophia found her thoughts returning to Baishan, to the unexpected kindness from someone she had been taught to fear, to the strange fluttering in her chest when their hands had touched. She pulled her journal from the shelf and began to write by candlelight, capturing the details of the encounter before they faded. As her pen moved across the page, she realized it was the first time in years she had felt truly alive, truly present in her own story. Outside, the storm raged on, covering the mountains in a blanket of white that would transform the landscape by morning. Inside, something equally transformative had begun, though Sophia wasn't yet ready to give it a name. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the world reborn in dazzling white. Sophia rose early, pulled on her warmest clothes, and stepped out onto the porch. The sun reflected off the snow with an intensity that made her eyes water, but she couldn't bring herself to go back inside. After the long confinement of the storm, the expansive beauty of the mountain landscape felt like an invitation to breathe more deeply, to see more clearly. She made her way carefully down the steps, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The woodpile stood as evidence that yesterday's encounter had been no dream. She ran her fingers over the neat stack, remembering the swift, sure movements of Baishan's hands. Something about the memory gave her courage. With determined steps, she retrieved the axe and approached a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. Positioning herself as she had seen Baishan do, she raised the tool, focused on her target, and swung. The blade bit into the wood, not perfectly centered, but deep enough to matter. Another swing, and the log split. "I did it," she whispered, a smile spreading across her face. It was a small victory, but it was hers. Throughout the day, as she went about her chores, melting snow for water, tending the fire, preparing a simple meal, Sophia found herself pausing to scan the tree line. She told herself it was merely caution, a sensible vigilance after encountering a stranger near her home. But each time her gaze lingered on the spot where Baishan had disappeared into the forest, she knew she was hoping for his return. The thought should have troubled her. 5 years of marriage had taught her to expect little from men, and 2 years of widowhood had shown her the surprising freedom of solitude. Yet something about the quiet Apache man had awakened a curiosity she thought long dormant. That evening, as twilight settled over the mountains, Sophia sat by the fire reading one of the few books Frederick had left behind. A collection of poetry she had read so many times, she could recite passages from memory. The familiar words offered comfort, but her mind kept wandering to the stranger who had split her wood and then vanished, leaving only questions in his wake. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily, the cold seeping through the cabin's walls despite the fire's efforts. Sophia added another log, grateful for the plentiful supply, and wrapped herself in a quilt her mother had made for her wedding. As she settled back into her chair, a sound from outside made her freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Her heart raced as she set aside her book and moved to the window. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing, but she saw nothing except the unbroken expanse of white. Had she imagined it? Was loneliness playing tricks on her senses? Then, just as she was about to turn away, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. A moment later, Baishan stepped into the moonlight, a dark figure against the gleaming snow. He carried something over his shoulders. A deer, she realized, freshly killed. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. He had returned. Without conscious thought, she moved to the door and opened it, the cold air rushing in to battle with the warmth of the fire. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, neither moved. Then, Baishan walked toward her with the same measured pace as before, his footsteps nearly silent despite the burden he carried. As he approached the cabin, Sophia found herself stepping aside, a silent invitation that he accepted with a nod. He ducked through the doorway, bringing with him the scent of pine and cold night air. The small space of the cabin seemed to shrink further with his presence, making her acutely aware of how long it had been since she had welcomed anyone into her home. "You return," she said, unsure whether it was a question or a statement. Baishan nodded, carefully lowering the deer to the floor near the door. "Winter is hard," he said, his English deliberate but clear. "You live alone." He gestured to the animal. "Meat will help." The simple explanation, delivered without expectation of gratitude, touched something deep within Sophia. In the 5 years of her marriage, Frederick had provided for her as a duty, something to be recorded in his mental ledger of obligations fulfilled. But this man, this stranger from a people she had been taught to fear, had thought of her hunger and acted without ceremony or expectation. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more deeply than she had the day before. "Please warm yourself by the fire." She watched as Baishan moved to the hearth, extending his hands toward the flames. The firelight played across his face, highlighting the strong angles of his cheekbones, the quiet alertness of his eyes. Without his outer layer of buckskin, she could see the lean strength of his frame, the way he held himself with a natural dignity that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with an inner certainty. "You hunt in the storm?" she asked, moving to the small kitchen area to put water on for tea. "The storm passed before dawn," he replied. "Deer move after snow, seeking food." He glanced at her from beside the fire. "You have a good place here, protected from wind, close to water." "It was my husband's choice," Sophia said, the words emerging before she had time to consider them. "He's gone now. Died 2 years ago." Baishan nodded, accepting the information, without the awkward expressions of sympathy she had grown tired of receiving from the few visitors who made the journey to her cabin. "You stay," he observed. "Many women would return to family." The lack of judgment in his tone made it easy to answer honestly. "My parents want me to join them in Cimarron, but—" She paused, searching for words to explain a decision she didn't fully understand herself. "This place is mine now, perhaps the only thing that truly is." Understanding flickered in his dark eyes. "To have a place of one's own is a rare gift," he said, and something in his voice suggested he spoke from experience. They fell into silence then, but it was not the empty silence that had filled Sophia's days since Frederick's death. This quiet held a different quality, a shared awareness that required no words. She finished preparing the tea and offered him a cup, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. As they sat together by the fire, the deer waiting to be dressed, Sophia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't with another person in longer than she could remember. There was something about Baishan's presence that demanded nothing, yet offered a steady companionship that felt both novel and familiar, like rediscovering a forgotten language. When he finally spoke again, his words surprised her. "I will show you how to prepare the deer," he said, "so you will know for next time." The offer, so practical and yet so intimate, made Sophia pause with her cup halfway to her lips. He was not simply bringing her food, he was offering knowledge, independence, the ability to provide for herself. "I would like that," she said simply, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile that transformed his solemn face. As the night deepened around the small cabin, Baishan began to teach Sophia the ancient art of dressing a deer. With patient hands, he demonstrated how to make the initial cuts, how to remove the hide with minimal waste, how to identify and preserve the most valuable parts of the animal. His movements were respectful, almost reverent, and he spoke quietly of the Apache belief that the deer offered its life as a gift that must be honored through careful use of every part. Sophia watched and learned, her initial squeamishness giving way to a focused attention. This was survival, pure and practical, stripped of the social niceties that had governed her life in St. Louis before her marriage. There was something freeing in the directness of it, in the connection to necessities that couldn't be hidden behind propriety or convention. By the time they finished processing the meat, some set aside for immediate cooking, the rest prepared for smoking or drying, the fire had burned low, and exhaustion pulled at Sophia's limbs. Yet she felt strangely energized, her mind alive with new knowledge, and the peculiar intimacy that had grown between them through shared work. When Baishan gathered his things to leave, Sophia felt a pang of disappointment she hadn't expected. "It's late," she said, gesturing to the darkness beyond the windows. "You could stay." Seeing his raised eyebrow, she hastily added, "By the fire. It's too cold to travel at night." For a long moment he studied her face, as if weighing something only he could see. Then he nodded once. "I will leave at first light," he said. That night, as Sophia lay in her bed with Baishan sleeping before the hearth in the main room, she listened to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in her home. It should have made her uneasy. This man was a stranger, from a people she had been taught were enemies. Instead, she felt a peculiar sense of rightness, as if a piece of her world that had been askew had settled into its proper place. Outside, an owl called into the night, its haunting cry echoing across the snow-covered landscape. Inside, two unlikely companions shared the warmth of a fire, and the beginning of a connection neither had sought, but both, perhaps, had needed more than they knew. For 3 days after that night, Sophia found herself watching the tree line, pausing in her chores to scan the clearing for any sign of movement. She told herself it was caution, a prudent vigilance after encountering a stranger on her property, but the flutter in her stomach when a shadow moved among the trees belied a different truth. On the 4th day, while hanging laundry to dry in the crisp mountain air, she spotted him. Baishan stood at the edge of the forest, a collection of plants and roots bundled in his arms, watching her with the same measured gaze as before. When their eyes met, he didn't retreat, but instead walked directly toward her, his footsteps nearly silent despite the frost-hardened ground. "You're back," Sophia said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Baishan nodded, lifting the bundle slightly. "Medicine plants," he explained, "for winter sickness. I will show you which to use." Again, the offer of knowledge rather than simple charity. Sophia felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the weak winter sun. "Please," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Come in." What followed was an afternoon of education, unlike any Sophia had received in the carefully supervised classrooms of her youth. Seated at her small table, Baishan laid out each plant, explaining its properties, how to identify it, how to prepare it for different ailments. His knowledge was extensive and precise, passed down through generations of his people, living in harmony with the demanding landscape. Sophia listened with rapt attention, making notes in her journal, asking questions that Baishan answered with the same thoughtful consideration he brought to everything. His patience never wavered, even when she struggled to pronounce the Apache names he taught her alongside the uses. "This one," he said, holding up a gnarled root, "stops bleeding. Powder it pack in wound." He demonstrated the grinding motion with his hands. "Saved my life once after soldier's bullet." The casual reference to violence made Sophia pause in her writing. "You fought soldiers?" Something shifted in Baishan's expression, a shadow passing across his features. "Sometimes," he said simply. "Sometimes I guided them. It was complicated." The hesitation in his normally confident speech told Sophia she had touched on something painful. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't pry." Baishan shook his head. "No need for sorry. Past is past." His eyes met hers across the table. "Like your husband. Gone, but still shapes your path." The perceptiveness of his observation startled her. "Yes," she admitted, "though sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew him at all." "You were not matched by choice?" Baishan asked, his tone curious rather than judgmental. Sophia smiled wryly. "Is anyone truly? My parents arranged it. Frederick wanted a wife to maintain his home while he traveled for business. I was 19 with few prospects and no dowry to speak of." She looked down at her hands, surprised to find herself confiding in this near stranger. "We were together 5 years before he died, but I sometimes think we never truly met." Baishan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My people believe a true match must be between equals," he said finally. "Not in skills or strength, but in spirit. In choice." "And did you find such a match?" Sophia asked before she could stop herself. A sad smile touched his lips. "Once," he said. "She died in childbirth. The baby, too." He spoke the words without inflection, but Sophia could see the old grief in the set of his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it deeply. Baishan nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "Life continues," he said, "like river after stone falls, changed, but still flowing." The simple wisdom of his words struck Sophia powerfully. How different from the elaborate mourning rituals she had been taught, the proper periods of grief, the social expectations that had bound her even in loss. Baishan's acceptance of pain as part of the river of life seemed at once both harder and more honest than anything she had been taught. As the light began to fade outside, Sophia realized they had spent hours at the table, surrounded by plants and conversation that had wandered far beyond their medicinal properties. She rose to light the lamps, suddenly aware of the intimacy that had grown between them through shared stories and silence. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, surprising herself with the ease of the invitation. "I have venison stew thanks to your last visit." Baishan's expression warmed slightly. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." Over the simple meal their conversation continued, moving from practical knowledge of survival to deeper exchanges about their different worlds. Sophia found herself telling him about her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams of becoming a teacher that had withered in the isolation of the mountains, the books she still treasured as windows to worlds beyond her cabin. In turn, he spoke of his people's traditions, the beauty of Apache ceremonies marking the seasons and life passages, the legends that explained the world around them. His English, while accented, was fluent enough to paint vivid pictures of a culture rich with meaning and connection to the land. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" Sophia asked as they finished their meal. Baishan's expression grew more guarded. "I was taken to mission school as boy," he said. 8 years. Then I worked as scout and translator for army." His tone remained neutral, but something in the set of his jaw suggested the experiences had not been entirely positive. "And now?" she asked, sensing there was more to his story. He was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to share. "Now I live between worlds," he said finally. "Not fully Apache anymore. Never will be white man. So I make my own path." His dark eyes met hers across the table. "Like you, in your cabin alone." The comparison startled Sophia, but she couldn't deny its truth. They were both outsiders in their own way, creating lives in the spaces between established boundaries. The recognition created a bridge between them, a shared understanding that transcended the obvious differences of their backgrounds. As the evening deepened, Baishan rose to leave, gathering the remaining plants into neat bundles for her to keep. At the door he paused, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I will come again," he said, not a question but not quite a statement either. "I would like that," Sophia replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. He nodded once, then slipped into the darkness, leaving Sophia standing in the doorway, watching his figure melt into the shadows of the trees. Only when the night air began to chill her skin did she close the door, returning to a cabin that somehow felt different than it had that morning, warmer, perhaps, or simply less empty. That night, as she prepared for bed, Sophia found herself moving with a new awareness of her own body. She brushed her hair with more care than usual, studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin, noted the color that lingered in her cheeks. It had been years since she had truly looked at herself, since she had felt the stirring of something that might be anticipation, might be hope. Outside, the winter moon cast silver light across the snow-covered landscape. Inside, something was changing, growing, like a seed long dormant finally reaching toward the sun. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged that gradually transformed Sophia's solitary existence. Baishan would appear every 3 or 4 days, sometimes with game, sometimes with useful plants or materials, always with knowledge to share. Each visit lasted longer than the last, their conversations gradually expanding beyond immediate survival to deeper exchanges about their different worlds. Sophia learned that Baishan had been born to the Mescalero Apache, but had spent years among white society, first at the mission school, then as a scout for the army. The experience had left him fluent in 3 languages, Apache, English, and Spanish, but trusted by none of the groups he could move between. He lived now on the margins, hunting and trapping, occasionally trading with settlements, but maintaining his independence from both his tribe and white society. In turn, she told him about her life before the cabin, her childhood in St. Louis, her education cut short by her father's business failures. Her brief season as a debutante before financial reality had reduced her marriage prospects to men like Frederick, established but unexciting, offering security rather than passion. She spoke of things she had never voiced aloud, finding in Baishan's attentive silence a freedom she had never known. With each visit, the distance between them diminished. What began as practical instruction, how to set snares for rabbits, how to identify edible plants, how to preserve meat for the lean months, evolved into genuine companionship. They would work together during the day, then sit by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories and silence with equal comfort. Sophia found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She took more care with her appearance, wearing her better dresses despite their impracticality for cabin life, arranging her hair in styles she had abandoned after Frederick's death. Each time Baishan noticed the changes, a subtle appreciation in his eyes that sent warmth spreading through her body. One evening in early January, as a particularly bitter wind howled outside, they sat before the fire in her cabin, closer than they had ever been before. Sophia was mending one of her dresses, while Baishan worked on a small carving, his knife moving with the same precise grace she had come to admire in all his movements. "May I ask you something?" she said, setting her sewing aside. He looked up, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You may. Are you not afraid coming here? If others from the settlement found you?" Baishan's hands stilled. "Fear is a luxury for those with many choices," he said. "My people are being pushed from their lands. Many have been killed or forced onto reservations far from here." His voice remained even, though Sophia could sense the deep well of emotion beneath his words. "I choose to live free, even if it means danger." "Is that why you're alone?" she asked softly. He met her gaze directly. "I was a scout for the army for 3 years. I believed their promises of peace, of protection for my people." The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. "When I saw the truth of their intentions, I left. Now I am trusted by neither side." The weight of his confession hung between them. Sophia understood suddenly that in helping her, Baishan had risked more than she had realized, that his solitude, like hers, was both a choice and a punishment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words seemed inadequate for the history of betrayal and loss they couldn't change. "Do not be sorry," he replied. "We cannot change what has happened. We can only choose what we do now." His eyes held hers, intense and unguarded for the first time. "And I choose to be here." The simplicity of his declaration, the quiet certainty of it, broke something open inside Sophia. 5 years of marriage, and Frederick had never once chosen to be with her when business called him elsewhere. 5 years of dutiful coexistence, and she had never felt seen the way she did in this moment, by this man who had every reason to consider her his enemy. Without conscious thought, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. Baishan went still, his eyes never leaving her face. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, with infinite slowness, he turned his palm upward, his fingers interlacing with hers. The calluses on his hand spoke of a life of survival, so different from her husband's smooth merchant's hands. The warmth of his skin seemed to flow into her, igniting something that had lain dormant for too long. "Sophia," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. She didn't know who moved first, only that suddenly the space between them vanished, and his mouth was on hers, tentative at first, then with growing urgency as she responded. His hand cradled her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep, while his kiss awakened hungers she had never known she possessed. When they finally drew apart, breathless, Sophia saw in Baishan's eyes the same wonder and desire that coursed through her own body. Outside, the wind continued its lonely howl across the mountains. Inside, the silence between them hummed with possibilities neither had dared imagine until this moment. "I should go," he said, his voice rough with emotion, though he made no move to release her hand. "Stay," Sophia whispered, the word both a request and a revelation. "Please, stay." In the flickering firelight, Baishan's expression softened into something so tender it made her heart ache. "Are you certain?" In answer, Sophia rose to her feet, drawing him up with her. With trembling fingers, she led him toward the small bedroom where she had spent so many nights alone with only her thoughts for company. Tonight would be different. Tonight, the bitter cold of loneliness would have no place in her bed. As they crossed the threshold together, Sophia felt as though she was stepping not just into her bedroom, but into a new life, one where she was not defined by what she lacked, but by what she dared to claim for herself. The single lamp cast long shadows across the room as they stood facing each other, the air between them charged with anticipation and a hint of nervousness. Sophia had never done this, never invited a man to her bed of her own choosing, never acted on desire rather than duty. With Frederick, intimacy had been brief and methodical, a transaction that left her body untouched even as it fulfilled social obligation. Baishan seemed to sense her uncertainty. With exquisite patience, he raised his hand to her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone as if memorizing its shape. "We do not need to rush," he said softly. "The night is long." The tenderness in his touch, the respect in his words, unlocked something in Sophia that years of proper behavior had kept tightly sealed. She leaned into his palm, turning to press a kiss against it, a gesture of trust and burgeoning desire. "I've never," she began, unsure how to express the magnitude of what she was feeling, the newness of wanting rather than submitting. "I know," he said simply, and somehow he did seem to understand what she couldn't articulate. With gentle deliberation, he began to show her what physical love could be when centered on mutual pleasure rather than obligation. His hands and lips explored her body with a reverence that made her feel both powerful and vulnerable, desired and cherished. He taught her the language of touch, how a caress could ask a question, how a sigh could be an answer, how two bodies could communicate in a primal tongue that needed no translation. For the first time in her life, Sophia discovered the pleasure her body was capable of feeling. Under Baishan's patient guidance, she learned to give voice to her desires, to reach for what she wanted, rather than passively accepting what was given. Each new sensation was a revelation, each shared breath a communion more profound than any she had experienced in the polite society of her youth. When they finally joined together, it was not the mechanical act she had known with Frederick, but a dance of equals, each giving and taking in equal measure. Baishan whispered to her in Apache, the foreign words like poetry against her skin. Though she couldn't understand their meaning, she felt their intent in the reverent way he moved with her, the tenderness with which he held her through waves of pleasure she had never imagined possible. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, their bodies cooling in the night air, Sophia felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness or regret, but from the overwhelming realization of how much had been kept from her, how narrow her understanding of intimacy had been, how limited her expectations of joy. Baishan noticed her tears, his expression immediately concerned. He brushed them away with gentle fingers, a question in his eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice catching on the words. "I never knew it could be like this." Understanding dawned in his face, followed by a tenderness that made her heart ache. He gathered her closer, his arms a shelter against all the lonely years that had preceded this night. "This is how it should always be," he told her, his lips brushing her temple. "Two people choosing each other, body and spirit. Nothing less is worthy." The simplicity of his declaration struck Sophia deeply. How different from the complex social contracts that had governed her understanding of marriage and intimacy. How much truer than the cold calculations of security and status that had led her to Frederick's bed. As the night deepened around them, Sophia and Baishan continued to discover each other through touch and whispered confidences. He traced the map of her body with reverent hands, learning its contours as she learned to voice her pleasure without shame. She explored the landscape of his form, the raised scar on his shoulder from a soldier's bullet, the intricate tattoo on his chest that marked his passage to manhood among his people, the strength and gentleness that coexisted in his hands. Outside, the winter wind gradually subsided, leaving behind a profound silence broken only by the occasional call of a night bird. Inside, two people from worlds that should never have intersected created their own universe of touch and trust, building something new in the space between their different pasts. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first hints of light, Sophia lay with her head on Baishan's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Something had fundamentally shifted during the night, some boundary crossed that could never be re-established. She knew with a certainty that should have frightened her but instead brought peace, that her life would never be the same. "What happens now?" she asked softly, the question encompassing far more than just the day ahead. Baishan's hand moved in slow circles against her back, his touch both comforting and awakening. "Now we choose," he said simply. "Each day, we choose." The profound freedom in his words both exhilarated and terrified her. Frederick's death had released her from one set of expectations, but society's grip remained. Invisible chains that had kept her isolated in this cabin, rather than facing the judgment that would come from building a different kind of life. "It won't be easy," she said, giving voice to the fear beneath her newfound happiness. "If anyone from the settlement found out about us—" "When has anything worth having been easy?" Baishan replied, a subtle challenge in his tone. "Your people see only Apache. My people see only white. But we see each other." He took her hand, placing it over his heart. "This is what matters." Sophia felt the steady beat beneath her palm and realized that for all the barriers between them, language, culture, history, in this most essential way they were the same. Two hearts beating, two souls seeking connection in a world determined to keep them apart. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's small window, gilding Baishan's skin with gold, Sophia made her choice. Whatever came next, whatever price they might pay for crossing the boundaries others had established, this connection was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth building a new life around, however uncertain that life might be. The day began with this silent vow, this private commitment between two people who had found in each other something neither had dared hope for: acceptance without condition, desire without duty, love without limitation. Dawn broke with gentle persistence over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. Sophia woke slowly, aware first of an unfamiliar warmth along the length of her body, then of the steady rhythm of another's breathing beside her. Baishan. Memory returned in a rush of sensation, his hands mapping the contours of her body with reverent patience, his whispered words in Apache that she couldn't understand but felt in the deepest parts of her soul, the way he had looked at her as if discovering something precious and unexpected. For the first time in her life, Sophia had felt truly desired, truly seen by another person. She turned carefully to study him in sleep. Without the watchful alertness that usually characterized his expression, Baishan looked younger, more vulnerable. The strong line of his jaw relaxed, his lips slightly parted, his dark hair spread across her pillow. Sophia resisted the urge to touch him, to assure herself that this wasn't a dream born of loneliness. As if sensing her gaze, Baishan opened his eyes. For a moment, something like surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a warmth that made Sophia's heart flutter. "You stayed," she whispered. His hand rose to brush a strand of hair from her face, fingers lingering against her cheek. "I stayed," he confirmed, his voice deep with sleep and something more intimate. In the clear light of morning, the enormity of what had happened between them should have felt frightening, forbidden. Instead, Sophia was filled with a sense of rightness that defied all she had been taught about the world and her place in it. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just the day ahead. Baishan's expression grew thoughtful. "Now we choose," he said simply. "Each day we choose." The profound freedom in his words both exhilarated and terrified her. Frederick's death had released her from one set of expectations, but society's grip remained, invisible chains that had kept her isolated in this cabin rather than facing the judgment that would come from building a different kind of life. "It won't be easy," she said, giving voice to the fear beneath her newfound happiness. "If anyone from the settlement found out—" "When has anything worth having been easy?" Baishan replied, a subtle challenge in his tone. "Your people see only Apache, my people see only white, but we see each other." He took her hand, placing it over his heart. "This is what matters." Sophia felt the steady beat beneath her palm and realized that for all the barriers between them, language, culture, history, in this most essential way, they were the same. Two hearts beating, two souls seeking connection in a world determined to keep them apart. They rose together, moving through the morning rituals with a new awareness of each other. Baishan built up the fire, while Sophia prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and dried fruit. They ate side by side at her small table, their knees touching beneath it, exchanging glances that contained entire conversations. "I must hunt today," Baishan said eventually, though he made no move to leave. "Winter grows deeper. We need more meat." The casual "we" sent a thrill through Sophia. For 5 years of marriage, she and Frederick had remained you and I, two separate lives running parallel, but never truly intersecting. This simple pronoun from Baishan's lips felt more intimate than any wedding vow. "I'll prepare the smoking rack," she replied, accepting his inclusion without question, "and gather more herbs from the root cellar." He nodded, his eyes reflecting an appreciation that went beyond her practical contributions. As they worked together to prepare for the day, Sophia marveled at how natural it felt, how effortlessly they moved around each other in the small cabin space, anticipating needs, offering assistance without being asked. When the time came for Baishan to leave, he took her face between his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "I will return before sunset," he promised. Sophia watched him disappear into the trees, his figure merging with the wilderness that was as much his home as any fixed dwelling. Only when he was out of sight did she press her fingers to her lips, still warm from his touch, and allow herself to acknowledge the depth of what was happening between them. "I'm falling in love with him," she whispered to the empty clearing, the words both frightening and liberating in their truth. The day passed in a blur of productive activity as Sophia channeled her nervous energy into preparing the cabin. She swept floors that didn't need sweeping, organized shelves already in order, and finally pulled out her best dress, saved for visits to her parents, and laid it across the bed with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. As promised, Baishan returned before sunset, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. His face, usually so composed, broke into a smile when he saw her waiting on the porch. It transformed him, that smile, making Sophia's breath catch at the knowledge that it was meant only for her. Together they prepared the rabbits, Sophia now more confident in the skills he had taught her. As they worked side by side, she told him stories from her childhood, of the Mississippi River in summer, of her father's bookshop where she had first discovered her love of reading, of the sister she had lost to fever when they were both still young. Baishan listened with the same intense focus he brought to everything, asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in understanding who she was and where she had come from. When he spoke of his own childhood among the Mescalero Apache, his words painted vivid pictures of a life governed by deep respect for the land and strong ties of kinship and responsibility. As night fell, and they retreated to the warmth of the cabin, something shifted between them. The urgent discovery of the previous night gave way to a slower exploration, a deliberate savoring of each touch, each kiss. Baishan taught her the Apache words for parts of her body, as his hands and lips traced them: hair, eyes, lips, heart. The foreign sounds becoming a sacred vocabulary of desire. Later, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, the fire burning low in the hearth, Sophia found herself overcome with an emotion too large for her chest to contain. "I never knew it could be like this," she confessed, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the contours of the scar on his chest, a remnant from a skirmish with soldiers, he had told her. "Like what?" he asked, his hand moving in slow circles against her back. "Like coming home," she replied, the words rising from some deep, honest place within her. "All my life, I've felt like a visitor in my own existence. Even in this cabin I was just passing through, waiting for something I couldn't name." She raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "But with you, I feel present, real, like I've finally arrived somewhere I belong." Baishan's expression softened into something so tender, it made her heart ache. He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "My people have a saying," he told her, his voice low and intimate in the darkness. "The Creator gives each soul many paths, but only one true journey." He pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Perhaps this is ours." The simple, profound acceptance in his words broke open something inside Sophia that had been locked away for too long. Tears spilled from her eyes, not of sadness but of release. The letting go of a loneliness so constant she had mistaken it for normal, the embrace of a connection so unexpected it could only be seen as a gift. Baishan wiped her tears away with gentle fingers, understanding without need for explanation. In that moment, Sophia knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever price they might pay for this crossing of boundaries, it would be worth it for these moments of perfect recognition between two souls. Outside, snow began to fall again, erasing tracks and softening edges, covering the harsh realities of the world beyond their door. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophia and Baishan created their own reality, one where differences of skin and history mattered less than the shared language of their hearts. As she drifted towards sleep, Sophia heard Baishan whispering in Apache, the words unfamiliar but their meaning somehow clear in the sacred space between wakefulness and dreams. He was mapping their journey with words, creating a story of two unlikely paths converging despite all odds. A story that, against all reason and custom, was becoming hers as well. The days that followed took on a rhythm as natural as the turning of the earth. Baishan would hunt or gather during daylight hours, while Sophia maintained their growing home, each contributing according to their strengths. Evenings were spent in shared tasks and quiet conversation, nights in explorations of desire that continued to reveal new depths of connection. While never explicitly discussed, it became clear that Baishan was spending more time at the cabin than away from it. His few possessions gradually found permanent places, his extra buckskins hanging beside her dresses, his hunting knife resting on the shelf near the door, his presence filling spaces that had stood empty for too long. January deepened into February, bringing colder temperatures and heavier snow. The isolation that had once felt like a prison to Sophia now seemed a blessing, cocooning them from the world that would judge their union impossible, forbidden. In their snowbound paradise, they created their own customs and celebrations, blending elements from both their cultures into something uniquely theirs. On particularly cold nights, Baishan would tell stories from Apache tradition, legends of how the world came to be, tales of trickster coyote and wise buffalo, lessons embedded in narrative that had sustained his people through generations. Sophia, in turn, would read aloud from the few books she possessed, introducing him to poetry and prose from authors whose words had been her companions through lonely years. They learned each other's languages in fragments, he teaching her Apache phrases, she helping him refine the English he had learned in mission school. Each new word was a bridge between their worlds, another thread in the tapestry they were weaving together. One evening in mid-February, as they sat before the fire sharing a stew of rabbit and wild onions, Sophia found herself thinking of the future with a clarity that both excited and frightened her. "What will happen when spring comes?" she asked, the question that had lingered unspoken between them finally finding voice. "When the pass is clear and people start traveling again." Baishan was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in the firelight. "What do you wish to happen?" he asked finally, his dark eyes meeting hers. The directness of his question took Sophia by surprise. Throughout her life, what she wished for had rarely been considered relevant. Not by her parents, not by Frederick, not by the society that had prescribed her path from birth. That Baishan would center her desires in planning their future was yet another revelation of how different this relationship was from anything she had known before. "I wish," she began, then paused, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I wish for us to remain together, however that might be possible. I don't want to return to living half a life, to pretending this never happened." Something shifted in Baishan's expression, a softening, a relief perhaps, as if he had been holding his breath awaiting her answer. "There are places," he said carefully, "where people like us can exist. Not easily, perhaps, but possible. Near the Mexican border, there are communities, Apache, Mexican, white, living together." No one asked too many questions about what came before. Hope bloomed in Sophia's chest, tempered by the reality of what such a move would mean. "My parents," she said softly, "they would never understand. They've already lost one daughter. To lose me as well." "The hardest journeys often demand the heaviest sacrifices," Baishan acknowledged, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But you would not be alone in bearing them." The promise in his words, the steadiness of his gaze, gave Sophia courage she hadn't known she possessed. In this man, this Apache warrior who should have been her enemy, according to every story she'd been told, she had found a partner who saw her clearly, who valued her choices, who offered support without demanding control. "We could begin again," she whispered, the possibility unfolding before her like a map to unknown territories. "Build something new together." Baishan nodded, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When the snow melts from the high passes," he said, "we will need to decide. Until then, we have this time to prepare, to strengthen what grows between us." That night, their lovemaking took on a new dimension, not just the discovery of pleasure, but the affirmation of a future being born between them. Each touch carried the weight of promise, each shared breath a vow more binding than any ceremony society might recognize. As February gave way to March, subtle signs of approaching spring began to appear. Longer days, the occasional drip of melting ice from the cabin's eaves, the return of birds long absent from the winter landscape. With these changes came a growing awareness that their secluded idyll had a limited time remaining. One morning, Sophia woke alone, the space beside her in bed empty but still warm. She found Baishan outside, studying tracks in the snow near the edge of the clearing. "Someone passed here," he said without preamble as she joined him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Two men on horseback. Yesterday, perhaps the day before." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Sophia. "Hunters?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Baishan shook his head, his expression grave. "Soldiers," he said, "army patrol, moving north toward the fort." The implications hung between them, unspoken, but clear. Their sanctuary was no longer as isolated as they had believed. The world beyond their small clearing was stirring from its winter sleep, bringing with it all the dangers and prejudices they had temporarily escaped. "Did they come near the cabin?" Sophia asked, scanning the tree line as if expecting to see uniforms emerging from the forest. "No," Baishan replied. "Their path runs along the ridge, but they will return this way. The snow is melting in the high country. Soon the passes will clear." The practical reality of their situation came into sharp focus. Whatever decision they made about their future, it would need to be soon. The relative safety of winter isolation was coming to an end. That afternoon, as they worked together to repair damage to the cabin's roof from winter storms, Sophia found herself studying Baishan with new intensity, the sure movements of his hands as he replaced damaged shingles, the quiet confidence with which he approached even unfamiliar tasks, the occasional glances he cast her way, as if reassuring himself of her continued presence. How strange, she thought, that this man who had entered her life as a stranger as a representative of everything she had been taught to fear, had become the center of her world in such a short time. How remarkable that in crossing the boundaries society had established, she had found not danger, but salvation, not shame, but dignity, not isolation, but the deepest connection she had ever known. That evening, as they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Baishan took her hand, his expression more solemn than usual. "I must leave tomorrow," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet between them. "For several days, perhaps longer." Fear clutched at Sophia's heart. "Because of the soldiers?" He nodded. "There is movement in the south. The army pushes those of my people who still resist toward the reservation." His jaw tightened briefly. "I must warn them. Help those who wish to escape north into Colorado." "It's dangerous," Sophia said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Baishan didn't deny it. "Yes," he admitted, "but necessary. These are my mother's people. I cannot abandon them, even though many see me as outsider now." The conflict in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Sophia understood suddenly that Baishan lived with divided loyalties, to his heritage, to his conscience, and now to her, that he was trying to honor all three without betraying any. "I understand," she said softly, and meant it. Whatever fears she had for his safety, she wouldn't add to his burden by voicing them. "When will you go?" "First light," he replied, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "While the snow still holds tracks, I can move faster alone." The unspoken question hung between them. Would she still be here when he returned? Would she wait for him, knowing the risks, accepting the uncertainty of their future? Sophia turned to face him fully, raising her free hand to touch his face, to trace the proud line of his cheekbone, the curve of his lips that had taught her what it meant to be truly desired. "I will be here," she promised, the words of vow as sacred as any spoken before an altar. "For as long as it takes." Relief and gratitude flooded Baishan's expression. He drew her close, his forehead coming to rest against hers in the gesture that had become their most intimate form of connection. "I will return to you," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "This I swear by all that is sacred." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of her bedroom, their bedroom now, Sophia memorized the contours of Baishan's body with hands and lips, storing each detail like provisions against the lean times ahead. He whispered promises against her skin in 2 languages, binding their futures together with words that transcended the boundaries others had drawn between them. In the grey light before dawn, Sophia watched as Baishan prepared to leave. He moved with the quiet efficiency she had come to admire, gathering only what was essential for his journey, checking his weapons with practiced hands. His face had taken on the focused expression she had come to recognize as his warrior aspect, alert, assessing, prepared for whatever might come. When the moment of departure could no longer be delayed, he turned to her, framed in the doorway with the winter landscape spread behind him. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into the pouch at his waist. He pressed a small wooden carving into her palm, an eagle in flight, its wings spread wide, every feather rendered with meticulous detail. Sophia recognized it as the piece he had been working on during quiet evenings by the fire. "Eagles mate for life," he told her, closing her fingers around the carving. "When they find their partner, they build a nest together that grows stronger with each passing season." His hand moved to rest against her abdomen, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I will return to help build our nest." The intimacy of the moment, the promise it contained, made Sophia's heart swell almost painfully in her chest. She reached up to touch the eagle feather that hung always at his temple. "May I?" she asked. At his nod, she carefully untied the small red thread that bound it to his hair. Then, removing a lock of her own hair, she twisted it together with the thread and retied the feather, her fingers working despite their trembling. "A part of me goes with you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A reminder of what waits for your return." Baishan touched the feather, now bound with her hair, his expression solemn. "I carry you with me," he promised. Then he kissed her, a kiss that spoke of beginning rather than ending, of faith in what was to come. With that he was gone, moving swiftly and silently into the forest until the trees swallowed him from sight. Sophia stood in the doorway long after he had disappeared, the wooden eagle clutched in her hand, its wings pressing into her palm. Only when the cold began to seep through her shawl did she retreat inside, closing the door against a world that would call what she and Baishan had found together impossible, forbidden, wrong. But as she placed the carving on the mantel above the fire, positioning it so the flames made the wings appear to move, Sophia felt a certainty that defied all the doubts that threatened at the edges of her mind. What she and Baishan had discovered in each other was not wrong. It was perhaps the only truly right thing she had ever known. The days following Baishan's departure stretched into weeks, each one a test of Sophia's newfound strength and patience. She maintained their home with the skills he had taught her, splitting wood with growing confidence, preserving the last of their shared provisions, keeping the cabin warm against the deepening cold of February. At night, she wrote in her journal by candlelight, recording not just the practical details of survival, but the transformation taking place within her heart, a blossoming of purpose and hope where before there had been only resignation. As February gave way to March, Sophia began to notice changes in her body, a tenderness in her breasts, a persistent queasiness in the mornings, a deep, bone-weary fatigue unlike anything she had experienced before. At first, she attributed these changes to worry over Baishan's extended absence. But one morning, as she knelt retching into a basin, the truth dawned on her with perfect clarity. She was carrying Baishan's child. The realization should have terrified her. An unmarried white widow pregnant with an Apache man's baby. There was no place in society for such a woman, such a child. Yet as Sophia pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, what flooded through her was not fear, but a fierce, protective joy. This child, conceived in love rather than duty, represented everything she and Baishan had found together, a future neither had dared imagine until they found each other. A future that defied the arbitrary boundaries drawn by those who saw differences before humanity. In that moment, cradling the secret life growing within her, Sophia made a decision. Whatever came next, whatever price she might pay, she would protect this child and the love that had created it. She would find the courage to claim the life she wanted rather than accept the one others believed she should have. The certainty of this resolve gave her new energy, focusing her efforts on preparing for whatever might come. She inventoried their supplies, identifying what they would need for a journey south, if that was the path they chose. She studied the maps Frederick had left behind, tracing possible routes to the border communities Baishan had mentioned. She practiced the survival skills he had taught her, determined to be a partner rather than a burden when they faced the challenges ahead. As March progressed, bringing warmer days and the first hints of green breaking through the melting snow, Sophia's worry for Baishan grew. He had warned that he might be gone for weeks, but each passing day tested her faith that he would return. The sound of distant gunfire one afternoon sent her into a panic that lasted until nightfall, her mind conjuring images of him wounded or captured, his promise to return made impossible by the violence that seemed to follow his people like a shadow. One night, unable to sleep, she stood at the window looking out at the moon-washed clearing, the wooden eagle clutched in her hand like a talisman. "Please come back to us," she whispered, one hand resting protectively over her abdomen where their child grew. "We need you." As if in response to her silent prayer, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Sophia's heart leapt to her throat, her body tensing with both hope and fear. Then, emerging into the moonlight with the same fluid grace she remembered, came Baishan. Relief flooded through her with such force that her knees nearly buckled. Without pause for a shawl or boots, she flung open the door and ran toward him, heedless of the cold ground beneath her feet, or the night air biting at her skin. He caught her against his chest, his arms enfolding her with a strength that drove the breath from her lungs and filled her heart to bursting. For a long moment, they simply held each other, no words needed to express the relief of reunion. When Sophia finally drew back enough to look up at him, she saw the changes these weeks had wrought. He was thinner, with new lines etched around his eyes that spoke of hardship and difficult choices. A healing cut ran along his jawline, and he favored his left side slightly, as if nursing a wound. "You're hurt," she said, her joy at his return tempered by concern. Baishan shook his head dismissively. "Nothing serious," he assured her. his voice husky with emotion or fatigue. "All that matters is that I am here now." Together they walked back to the cabin, his arm around her waist, as if unwilling to allow even the smallest distance between them. Inside, in the light of the fire she kept burning, Sophia could see more clearly the toll his journey had taken. Beyond the physical signs of hardship, there was a gravity to his expression that hadn't been there before, a shadow in his eyes that spoke of things seen and decisions made that weighed heavily on his spirit. "What happened?" she asked softly, as she heated water for tea, watching him settle gingerly into the chair by the fire. Baishan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "War comes," he said finally, "not declared with papers and speeches, but war nonetheless. The army moves against those who refuse the reservation. My people fight back where they can, but it is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Uneven, like wolf against bear." Sophia brought him tea and sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Were you able to warn them?" He nodded. "Some, those who would listen. Some are too proud, believe they can still win through courage alone." A hint of bitterness crept into his voice. "They do not understand the numbers, the weapons arrayed against them. And the others, those who listened, moving north," he said. "Small groups traveling at night, avoiding settlements. Some will reach Colorado, perhaps join the northern bands where the fighting is less fierce." He looked down at their intertwined hands. "I guided them as far as the high pass, then turned back. My path lies elsewhere now." The certainty in his words, the implication that he had chosen to return to her rather than continue with his people, filled Sophia with both gratitude and humility. She understood the magnitude of what he had sacrificed, the divided loyalties he navigated in choosing their future together over his traditional obligations. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart racing with anticipation. "Something wonderful." Baishan's expression softened, the shadows receding slightly from his eyes as he waited for her to continue. Taking a deep breath, Sophia placed his hand against her abdomen where their child grew. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. "A child born of both our worlds." Understanding dawned in Baishan's eyes, followed by an expression of such profound wonder and joy that it answered every doubt that had plagued her lonely nights. He knelt before her, pressing his forehead against the place where his hand had rested, whispering words in Apache that needed no translation. When he looked up at her, his eyes shone with tears and determination. "Now we must decide," he said. "The world will not make this easy for us." Sophia reached down to touch his face, to trace the proud line of his cheekbone, the curve of his lips that had taught her what it meant to be truly desired. "I've already decided," she told him. "My place is with you. Our child's place is with both of us." She gestured toward the cabin behind them. "This can be our beginning, not our hiding place." Baishan rose to his feet, taking both her hands in his. "There is a place," he said carefully, as if sharing a closely guarded secret. "South of here, near the border, a village where others like us have found refuge. Apache, Mexican, white, people who choose to see beyond the boundaries others create." His eyes searched hers, gauging her reaction. "It would mean leaving everything you know." Sophia thought of her parents in Cimarron, of the life she had been expected to live, of the narrow confines of propriety that had kept her isolated and unfulfilled. Then she thought of the freedom she had discovered in Baishan's arms, the strength she had found in his absence, the future growing within her body. "You are everything I know now," she replied, the words a vow as sacred as any spoken before an altar. "You and our child." Baishan's smile was like the first warm day after a long winter, full of promise and renewal. "Then we leave with the spring thaw," he said, his voice rich with certainty. "We begin again together." As he spoke, the sun broke through the clouds that had hung over the mountains all morning, bathing the clearing in golden light. Sophia looked up at the man who had taught her what it meant to truly live, truly love, and felt the weight of loneliness that had been her constant companion for so many years finally lift from her shoulders. In its place bloomed a certainty as clear and bright as the New Mexico sky above them, that love, when real and true, created its own legitimacy, that boundaries meant to divide could be crossed by hearts brave enough to recognize each other across the distances of culture and history. That sometimes the most courageous act was simply to choose joy over fear, connection over isolation, love over convention. The next weeks were filled with preparations for their departure. Once the decision was made, both Sophia and Baishan approached the task with focused determination, sorting through the cabin's contents to identify what should be taken, what could be sold, what must be left behind. Frederick's remaining possessions, his clothes, his business ledgers, the few personal items he had kept at the cabin, were packed into a trunk to be delivered to his former business partner in Cimarron. It would be Sophia's final act of obligation to the man who had been her husband, a closing of that chapter of her life. Her own belongings required more difficult choices. The practical limits of what they could transport meant prioritizing necessities over sentiment. Still, certain items were non-negotiable. Her mother's quilt, her father's gift of poetry books, her journal documenting the transformation from dutiful wife to woman, choosing her own path. As April arrived, bringing longer days and the first wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow, they began to prepare for the journey itself. Baishan repaired the small wagon Frederick had used for supply runs, reinforcing its frame and greasing its axles. Sophia sewed hidden pockets into their clothing and bedrolls for the modest store of coins that would fund their new beginning. The plan they developed was careful, strategic. They would travel by night when possible, avoiding larger settlements, presenting themselves when necessary as a white widow, and her Apache guide heading south to join family. It wasn't without risk, but with Baishan's knowledge of the territory and Sophia's ability to navigate white society when needed, they believed they could reach the border safely. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sophia found herself thinking of her parents. Though estranged by distance and her choice to remain at the cabin after Frederick's death, they were still her family, the connection to her past that she would be severing by leaving without explanation. "I should write to them," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "My parents. Not to explain everything, but to let them know I'm safe, that I've chosen a different path." Baishan considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It would give them peace," he agreed, "but could also create danger if they try to find you." Sophia sighed, recognizing the truth in his words. "I could have the letter delivered after we're gone," she suggested. "Ask someone passing through Cimarron to deliver it in a few weeks' time." He nodded, taking her hand in his. "A final kindness," he said. "Closure for them. Freedom for you." The understanding in his voice, his recognition of the complexity of her feelings toward the family she was leaving behind, was yet another reminder of why she had chosen this path. Baishan saw her, not as a daughter to be directed, not as a wife to be managed, but as a woman making her own choices with full awareness of their consequences. That night, by candlelight, Sophia composed the letter. It was brief, deliberately vague about her destination, but clear in its message. She was well. She had found a new purpose. She would always carry their love with her, even as she built a different life than the one they had envisioned for her. She asked for their understanding, if not their blessing, and promised that someday, when circumstances allowed, she would find a way to let them know that she was thriving. As she sealed the envelope, tears blurred her vision, not of regret but of recognition that every new beginning required certain endings, that the path she and Baishan were forging would demand sacrifices from both of them, severing ties that could not easily be restored. Yet when she looked up to find him watching her from across the room, his dark eyes reflecting both compassion for her pain and certainty in their shared future, Sophia knew beyond doubt that what they were building together was worth whatever price they might pay. The appointed day of their departure dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed to break the heart of anyone leaving a beloved place. Sophia stood in the doorway of the cabin, taking in the view she had seen countless times but would never see again. The clearing where she had first encountered Baishan, the mountains that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, the small garden plot where the first green shoots were just beginning to emerge from soil she had tended. "Are you ready?" Baishan asked softly from behind her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. Sophia covered his hand with her own, drawing strength from his touch. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. This place held memories both bitter and sweet, but it was just a place. What mattered, what she was taking with her, was the love that had transformed her understanding of what life could be. With one last look, she closed the door behind them and turned toward the wagon where their carefully packed belongings waited. The horse, borrowed from a trapper's cabin Baishan knew to be abandoned until fall, stamped impatiently, eager to be moving in the cool morning air. As they prepared to depart, Baishan took something from his pouch, a small bundle of sage and sweetgrass tied with red thread. He lit it with a match, allowing the fragrant smoke to rise in the still air. "For protection," he explained, moving the smoldering bundle in a circular motion around them, the wagon, the horse. "And to give thanks for what this place has given us." The simple ceremony, performed with quiet reverence, brought tears to Sophia's eyes. How different from the elaborate rituals of the church she had been raised in, yet how similar in its essence. An acknowledgement of forces larger than themselves, a request for blessing on their journey, a gratitude for gifts received. When the sage had burned down, Baishan helped Sophia onto the wagon seat, then took his place beside her. With a gentle flick of the reins, they began to move, the wagon creaking slightly as it rolled down the path, leading away from the clearing. Sophia didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed on the trail ahead, on the man beside her, on the future they were creating together step by step, choice by choice. As they entered the shelter of the trees, leaving the cabin behind, she felt not loss but liberation, the exhilarating freedom of a life being written not according to others' expectations, but by her own heart's deepest truth. The journey south was not without challenges. Spring weather in the mountains proved unpredictable, with warm sunny days giving way to sudden snowstorms that forced them to seek shelter in caves or abandoned miners' shacks. They encountered other travelers occasionally, trappers, prospectors, the occasional army patrol, and each time Sophia would play the role of widowed settler being escorted south by a hired guide, her growing belly concealed by carefully arranged shawls and loose dresses. Baishan's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable, allowing them to avoid the most traveled routes while still finding passable trails for the wagon. At night, they would make camp in sheltered spots away from the main trails, sharing a fire and the growing excitement of the new life they were creating together. During these quiet evenings, they would talk of the future, making plans for the home they would build, the skills they would share with their child, the community they hoped to find among others who had chosen to live beyond society's rigid boundaries. Baishan would tell stories from Apache tradition about the responsibilities of parents, the sacred nature of children as gifts from the Creator, the importance of teaching young ones to walk in harmony with the world around them. Sophia, in turn, would share her hopes for their child's education, a blending of both their cultures, learning to read and write, while also understanding the wisdom of living close to the land. She would sing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, her hand resting on her growing belly, as if the child within could already hear and understand. These conversations, extending late into the night beneath star-filled skies, cemented their vision of a shared future, not an erasing of their differences but a celebration of them, a new way of being that honored both traditions while creating something uniquely their own. As they moved farther south, the landscape began to change, high mountain forests giving way to more arid terrain, with stretches of desert broken by river valleys where cottonwoods and willows created oases of green. The air grew warmer, the nights shorter, the sense of leaving behind all that was familiar more pronounced with each passing day. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of travel, they crested a ridge to see before them a small village nestled in a river valley. Adobe buildings gleaming golden in the late afternoon sun. Fields of corn and beans surrounded the settlement, and the smoke of cooking fires rose in thin spirals against the cloudless sky. Baishan reined the horse to a stop, allowing them both to take in the view. Tres Cruces, he said quietly, named for the 3 crosses on the hill beyond the village. A place of refugees, of new beginnings. Sophia studied the settlement, noting the mix of architectural styles, some buildings clearly Mexican in influence, others showing Apache adaptations, still others with elements of Anglo construction. Even from this distance, she could see people moving about their daily tasks, a community functioning together despite the differences that would have separated them in the world she had left behind. "Will they accept us?" she asked, a flutter of nervousness in her chest. For all their planning, this moment of arrival of presenting themselves to those whose acceptance they needed, suddenly seemed fraught with possibility for rejection. Baishan took her hand, his touch reassuring. "They are people who have made similar choices," he said, "who have crossed boundaries to build lives of their own making. They understand what it means to seek a place where love matters more than where you were born, or the color of your skin." His confidence steadied her, reminding her of all they had already overcome to reach this point. With a deep breath, she nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "Then let's go home," she said. As they descended toward the village, Sophia felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was not the life she had been raised to expect, not the path society had laid out for her as a proper white woman of her time. Yet it was the life she had chosen with open eyes and full heart, the future she was building with the man who had taught her what love could truly be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she had no illusions that their journey would be without difficulties, they would face them together. Two people from worlds that should never have intersected, creating something new at the boundaries where those worlds met. As they approached the first buildings of the village, a small group gathered to meet them, men and women of different backgrounds, their expressions curious but not unwelcoming. Baishan spoke briefly in Spanish, then Apache, then English, introducing them as newcomers seeking a place to belong, to raise their child, to contribute to the community that had found a way to exist beyond the divisions of the wider world. An older woman stepped forward, her face weathered by sun and years, her eyes sharp with assessment but not unkind. She looked from Baishan to Sophia, noting their clasped hands, the protective way he positioned himself slightly ahead of the wagon, the quiet determination in Sophia's gaze. "You have come a long way," she said in accented English, her tone neither approving nor condemning, simply stating fact. "Yes," Sophia replied, meeting the woman's eyes directly, "but every step was chosen." Something shifted in the older woman's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or a memory of her own journey to this place. She nodded once, then gestured toward the village behind her. Then, "Welcome to Tres Cruces," she said, "a place for those who choose their own paths." As they followed the small procession into the heart of the village, Baishan's hand warm and steady in hers, Sophia felt the last weight of doubt lift from her shoulders. They had arrived not at an ending, but at a beginning. The first chapter of a story they would write together, day by day and choice by choice. A story that had begun with a simple act of kindness during a snowstorm and would continue far beyond the boundaries of the life Sophia had once believed was her only option. A story born, like all true things, from love. New Mexico border, 1880. The evening air carried the scent of pinon smoke and desert sage, as Sophia sat on the porch of their adobe home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. 5 years had passed since she and Baishan had left her cabin in the northern mountains, seeking a place where their love could flourish beyond the reach of those who would deny its validity. They had found it here, in this small mixed community nestled in a fertile valley just south of the border. A place neither fully Mexican nor American, where people of different backgrounds had created something new together. A community based on mutual respect and shared survival rather than arbitrary divisions of race or nationality. "Mama, look what I found!" Sophia turned to see her 4-year-old daughter, Esperanza, running toward her, dark braids flying behind her, something clutched in her small hands. Behind her walked Baishan, carrying their 1-year-old son, Thomas, on his shoulders. The sight of them, her family, her heart walking outside her body, filled Sophia with a joy so complete it sometimes frightened her with its intensity. "What treasure have you discovered today?" she asked, as Esperanza reached the porch steps, her face flushed with excitement. The little girl opened her hands to reveal a perfectly formed eagle feather. "Papa says it's a blessing," she announced, her expression solemn despite her breathlessness. "A sign that the Great Spirit watches over our family." Sophia met Baishan's eyes over their daughter's head, sharing a private smile at the memory that single word evoked, eagle, the symbol that had carried their promise through separation and doubt. "Your papa is very wise," she said, pulling Esperanza into a one-armed embrace, while reaching out her other hand to Baishan as he climbed the steps, their son giggling with delight at the height of his perch. As the sun slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their small but thriving homestead, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had not been easy. They had faced prejudice, hardship, and danger along the way. Her parents had disowned her when they learned of her choice, though her mother had secretly sent a letter last year, tentatively opening a door that might one day lead to reconciliation. But for every difficulty, there had been unexpected joys. The community that had welcomed them without question. The small school where Sophia now taught children of multiple heritages and languages. The respect Baishan had earned as a tracker and hunter who helped keep them all safe in this still wild territory. And most precious of all, their children, Esperanza with Baishan's dark eyes and Sophia's determined spirit, Thomas with his father's quiet strength already evident in his infant determination. "What are you thinking?" Baishan asked, settling beside her on the bench, Thomas now contentedly playing with the wooden eagle carving that had traveled with them from the northern cabin. "I'm thinking about choices," Sophia replied, leaning against his shoulder. "About how the hardest ones often lead us exactly where we need to be." Baishan's arm encircled her waist, his touch as familiar and essential as her own heartbeat. "The mountain cannot tell the river where to flow," he said. Using one of the Apache sayings that had become part of their family's private language, it can only stand witness to the journey. Esperanza climbed into Sophia's lap, the eagle feather now tucked safely in her pocket. "Tell the story, Mama," she requested, her eyes bright with anticipation. "The one about the snow and the wood." Sophia exchanged a smile with Baishan. It was their daughter's favorite bedtime tale, the story of how her parents had met, carefully edited for young ears, but preserving the essential truth of two people finding each other across divides meant to keep them apart. "Once," Sophia began, her voice soft in the gathering twilight, "there was a woman who lived alone in a cabin in the mountains. She thought she knew what her life would be, small and quiet and solitary, until one day, when she couldn't split the wood she needed to keep warm." As she continued the familiar narrative, Baishan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become their most constant form of communication. 5 years together had taught them that some bonds needed no words, that some connections transcended language and custom and history. Around them, the community prepared for night, lamps being lit in nearby homes, children being called in for supper, the distant sound of a guitar starting up for evening entertainment. Their world was small, perhaps, compared to the cities Sophia had once read about in her father's books, but it was rich in the things that truly mattered. Later, after the children were asleep, Sophia and Baishan stood together in the doorway of their home, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. "Do you ever regret it?" Baishan asked quietly, the question one they revisited from time to time. An affirmation rather than a doubt. "Leaving everything you knew." Sophia turned to face the man who had taught her what love could be, patient and fierce, gentle and unyielding, a daily choice made with open eyes and full hearts. The years had added silver threads to his black hair, new lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and vigilance, in a world that was still not always kind to those who defied its categories. "I didn't leave everything," she corrected him, raising her hand to touch the eagle feather that still hung at his temple, now bound with threads of their children's hair alongside her own. "I brought the only things that mattered." Baishan's smile, still rare enough to feel like a gift each time, transformed his face. He drew her into his arms, his forehead coming to rest against hers in the gesture that had become their most intimate form of connection. 5 years, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "And still, every morning I wake surprised by joy." 5 years, Sophia echoed, her arms encircling his waist, anchoring herself to this man who had shown her a way of being in the world she would never have found alone. And a lifetime still to come. Inside their home, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved beyond measure. Outside, the desert night enfolded them in quiet darkness, a vastness that reminded them of how small human divisions truly were against the backdrop of mountains and stars that had witnessed centuries of such boundaries being drawn and, occasionally, transcended by those brave enough to choose love. As Baishan led her back inside to the warmth of the home they had built together, Sophia felt gratitude fill her heart like water in a desert arroyo after rain, sudden, powerful, life-giving. For the woman who had once believed that duty and loneliness were all she could expect from life had discovered a truth both simple and revolutionary. That love, when founded on respect and choice rather than obligation, could create worlds where none had existed before. That crossing boundaries with an open heart could lead not to loss, but to unexpected abundance. That sometimes the most profound act of courage was simply to recognize one's own capacity for happiness and to claim it without apology. In the soft darkness of their bedroom, Sophia and Baishan renewed the promises they had first made in a snowbound cabin 5 years before. Promises that had withstood separation, prejudice, and the countless daily challenges of forging a life together against all odds. Promises that would continue to sustain them through whatever joys and sorrows the future might hold. For they had learned the most essential lesson of all, that love, true love, was neither a luxury nor a weakness, but the very foundation upon which a meaningful life must be built. And having found it in each other, against all probability, they would never take for granted the miracle of two paths converging to become one journey, shared with open eyes and grateful hearts. A journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness during a snowstorm, and would continue day by day and choice by choice for all the days they were granted together beneath the vast New Mexico sky. The end. Dear listener, you may feel alone sometimes, perhaps more often than you'd like to admit. But please remember this: you are never truly alone. Not when a story can sit beside you like a quiet friend. Not when a memory whispers your name. Not when someone somewhere is thinking of you with love. Sometimes companionship arrives in unexpected forms, through a kind neighbor, a phone call from family, a message from a friend far away, or even a voice in a story like this one, gently reaching across time and space to say you matter. If you open your heart just a little, you'll see that life still has soft places to rest. There is still laughter to be found, still beauty in a quiet sunrise, still love to give and receive even in the smallest gestures. Often, when we allow ourselves to receive more, something begins to shift. The days feel lighter, the silence feels warmer, and good things begin to find their way back to us. So tonight, take a deep breath and trust that somewhere, in this great wide world, you are valued, and yes, you are loved. With all our gratitude, Wild West Whispers team. Thank you so much for being with us until the very end. If this story brought you warmth, strength, or even a single moment of peace, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a comment, giving us a like, and sharing it with someone who might need a little hope today. From the bottom of our hearts, your support keeps our creative fire burning. At the end of this video, you'll see another story suggestion from our channel. Click and be surprised by more emotional, unforgettable tales like this one. Thank you for being here. Your Wild West Whispers family.